conference. So I'd like to introduce our second speaker. Our second speaker is Rita Bateson. So she is an educator and author, hi Rita, and a mentor with 20 years experience of international education. She had, like Dan, she's had a career in education before she joined the IB as a senior curriculum and assessment manager. Rita is currently the co-founder and director of education at Eblana. Her talk today is about the potential environmental impact of AI, and how even where AI is free to use, and which is how many people interact with it, how it can come at a cost, even one that's hidden. So please join me in welcoming Rita.
Thank you. I'll do a quick pulse check. Is there anybody who was in this room on my birthday in June for the E-Assessment Association? Anybody who joined us in Dublin for the EATP? You'll hear some bits of this before, hopefully not recycling too many statistics or worse still, too many jokes. But as you can hear and as you can see, I'm not from around here. I'd love to talk to you. Now, Daddy has told us to throw our caps over the wall and be ambitious, and Mummy's here to say, now careful, hang on, just a second. Careful, like Mrs. Doyle in Father Ted, careful now. What I really want to do is I want to say, yes, we need innovation, we need inspiration, and we need to rethink these big ideas sustainably. And that's why I was really excited to see the theme and the statements around this day in this summit, because we want to adopt sensibly, ethically, and sustainably. And not enough work on any of our parts is being done in terms of what is the data behind that? What are the decisions that we're making without necessarily calculating and projecting forward? So as mentioned, I joined the IB. My head is in assessment and my heart is in curriculum. I'm a mathematics and physics teacher by training, as you can probably see from the shoes. And it is deeply, deeply important to me that as we make these decisions, I joined the IB for this very reason. In 2013, we were moving to on-screen assessment for the middle years program, and that was an exceptionally exciting opportunity for me. To imagine video in an examination, which in 2013 seemed impossible. To think about hover-overs, to think about accessibility, that was the dream. And I'm still dreaming that dream, and now I'm terrified of the cost as well. So one of the things I'd like to talk to you about is this idea that Ireland, for those of you who've been there, we're very proud of our reputation as the island of saints and scholars and now data centres, because we are beholden to them. We're incredibly, incredibly beholden to foreign direct investment, which has a knock-on effect in terms of all the political decisions that are being made, in terms of all the environmental decisions that are being made. I'll talk about that in a moment, but it is a message from your next door neighbour. So I was away for 20 odd years. I came back to a very, very different Dublin than I left. And one of the things I noticed is that we have moulded and adopted our whole culture and enterprise focus around foreign direct investment because it was our massive unlock. I grew up in the 80s in Dublin, which was dire. It was grey and it was miserable. And as you all probably know, we were the poor cousin next door. And we have gotten an incredible boost, an incredible investment opportunity, and some very tasty tax laws to keep them there. And we are attached to that, and we're very, very much enjoying it. We've grown to like flat whites and being able to pay our mortgage. And as a result, we really can't allow anything to get in the way of that development. So one of the things I want to talk to you about is it has been very clear in the last 2 to 3 years, for me especially, since lockdown. We had a very long lockdown. We had 2 years of lockdown, which generated vast amounts of data. And those two things are not unconnected, right? And in the last couple of months, I noticed that my broadband was dropping 8-9 times a day. I noticed that we were having power cuts for the first time since the 80s in my location. And I'm in Dublin, and I started to look into some of these statistics. I was shocked to learn that 1/5 of Ireland's electricity grid is currently being consumed by the data centres. And in Dublin, it's even worse, 50%. It's actually up at 55% now. 55% of all energy consumed is being consumed by the data centres. I have the council driven mad. I ring them all the time to update this statistic because it was in one article in the Irish Times once, and it's been in a couple of reports from the government. So I will ring them and say, what are the stats now? What are the stats now? What are we doing about it? Because it's very hard to run an AI business as a startup in a situation where the broadband drops every call you make. And the internet and the electricity are liable to go at any moment. And I know poor little Ireland, we're having energy blackouts, but it isn't far to think that this will happen outside of our jurisdiction. We have a crumbling Victorian infrastructure. Sound familiar? We have a problem with energy, not so much with water. We've got lots of water. And AI is being attributed to that massive rise. It was 5 to 6% a few years ago. It's now 50%. So they're actively diverting energy from homes and hospitals to make sure the data centers don't go down. And what that means for us particularly is that we have pretty much openly accepted we're not going to meet our climate change targets. We're not going to meet our CO2 targets, partially farming, but also this. And in the last 2 months, it's increased by about another 2%, would you believe, entirely due to drone deliveries. We have now drone deliveries in Dublin, in the kind of the northwest section, and the energy consumption of those with the algorithms has contributed to it. So it is incredible the amount of energy that is going into them. So that started me digging and thinking, what are the environmental impacts? And more importantly, rather than point at something and say, oh, bad, what are we going to do in terms of how we project in assessment and in education what we truly care about? Because if we've given up on our sustainable development goals, if we've given up on our climate change targets, and Ireland is now looking for 26 billion, I think, is that the statistic? Something like 26 billion to pay off these fines, to keep our data centers humming and increasing, then we have a serious thing to think about. Then we have a serious issue to unpack. Now, of course, we can pass the responsibility back to the demand. Big tech, as soon as Ireland said, okay, that's it, no more data centers in Dublin. We have a moratorium now, no more. Don't build anymore, very naughty. Big tech came to the government and proposed, we will build our own infrastructure. If you allow us, we'll have a parallel system. The government obviously was a little bit nervous. I haven't heard any progression on this issue, but it's so interesting to think that money is no object, that structural capacity and building is within their grasp. And they could fix the infrastructure for us. But the choice, of course, is always, we need to feed the demand. We need to prioritize the adoption and acceleration of AI. And I think we do. I think it's fair to say we absolutely do. And it's very difficult to pick apart the consumption. As I was listening to a certain podcast this morning on the dangers and the debate around e-assessment or the move to on-screen, I noticed, besides a change in narration, which was funny, I noticed that the idea of e-waste is like a black hole in this conversation. We cannot think about the e-waste, or otherwise I will get sucked into a Black Mirror world. But what I think about is the energy from training of the model, through refining of the model, through consumption of the outputs of the model, and how it's scaling dramatically. So that's what I'd like to talk to you about a little bit today. I'd like to talk about where we can try and put some data on this processes, which is, by nature, quite proprietary. There is no interest in sharing this information. We hear about it through press releases, for example, this week with Meta announcing the size of their latest data center. Or we'll hear it when the UAE wants to invest $1.3 trillion in AI. Or when Stargate announces 80 billion investment, and that's topped the next month with more billies and more billies and more billies. It is accelerating and insane. So one of the things that we try and have schools and institutions and all of you is think about the relative investment at every stage of AI, some of which we're responsible for, and some of which is not our problem. So if we think about the energy that's required in the processing, in servers, in the cooling, in the latency of response, in the vast calculations that make AI possible. AI feels incredibly free and incredibly light, and it's anything but. We have statistics that have been queried and bandied about. Here's one of my favorite zombie queries, which I genuinely believed at first and has been roundly debunked, that one query can use up to 500 milliliters. Now, it's a zombie statistic in that we keep seeing it. It's actually a tiny fraction of that amount. And when it comes to Ireland's context, we're not really worried about the water. We've got tons of rain. But in other jurisdictions, New Orleans, for example, it's not how much clean water is available, it's who has access to it. And you'll see an awful lot of counterpoints and counter-arguments saying, well, the water is recycled, for example. Or all water cycle will return back to nature. And we'll talk a little bit more about that climate change denial language that we see. But it's really important to think about energy and water as we make these active value judgments in assessment. We have choices. We have choices on the energy that we choose to invest in the training of a model. Now, MIT did quite a good study on this recently, and I would lean on some of their statistics, if not all of them. But the investment into training a model, and not one, but 7 or 8 simultaneously, we know they're always working on the next 6 models. So if you think about one, a relatively old-fashioned one now, if we think about ChatGPT 4 a while ago, that took over $100 million for that single training of that model. $100 million, most of which probably didn't go to the engineers, most of which went to energy and calculation and compute. And if we think about that, that's equivalent to powering San Francisco for 3 days. And the last time I mentioned this statistic, there were 9 different models in ChatGPT. They've resolved all of that user interface now, but those models still exist. And the energy that was invested in them still has been consumed. And the refinement and the updating of these models, constantly drawing huge amounts of energy. So we were on track, when I spoke here in June, I think we were on track to equate the energy consumed by AI alone to the national consumption of Netherlands. Now we're way past that. We're into Japan, and by the end of the year, we're looking much, much higher than that. Because I don't think any of our calculations took into the fact of 800 million users per week. And 800 million users per week, not just doing text, but doing images, doing memes, doing deepfakes, doing world models. So we're talking about a scale factor here that is beyond what we were talking about 3 months ago even. So in June, I was hoping to have people think about, okay, text generation. Of all of the deadly sins, it's the least deadly. So text generation, text to text, voice to text, low energy, okay. Maybe a watt hour, maybe a little bit more, depending on your range of values and the assumptions that you have to make. Low energy, but very frequent. In June, I was saying as an example, a student might use AI for 10 to 15 queries a day. Can anybody guess how many queries on average, when I go into schools now, students are doing per day? Shout me a number. 10 to 15 a day, 3 months ago. How many are they doing now? 30. Keep going. Ooh, somebody said 200. 200. In one estimate, we actually asked the students to share with us. They're very reluctant to show their own data, obviously, but they'll tell you what their friends are doing. Oh, my friend is doing. My friend uses this humanized AI, my friend. We looked at them. 200 was the minimum that we found. And that was during a school day. And now, this is an international school, so they have their laptops open all the time. They're frequently using it. They're encouraged by some progressive schools to use it. I'm not. And they, honestly, are doing the right thing according to the rules of the school at the moment. We want to be progressive, we want to use it, and that use becomes very dependent. We're seeing cognitive offloading in some of these schools that we work with international schools around the world. So I get a nice diverse perspective. I get to see students who are overusing it. I get to see students who are scared of it. I get to see students who make very, very, very determined decisions. And then I also see students who spend time on TikTok, where TikTok is telling them to unlock God mode, or this is how you do a 2 a.m. trauma dump, or all kinds of interesting and weird subcultural phenomenon that is encouraging their use, whether good or bad. Now, 3 months ago, I was worried about some of the image generators. I am now terrified with Sora 2, for example. The amount of energy that's consumed for those 30-second videos, sometimes 6 seconds, sometimes 8 seconds, huge, huge consumers. So if one image is equivalent to, and this is again a very imperfect calculation, but if one image is equivalent to 3 charges of a mobile phone, that's a value decision. That's an active decision that we say, okay, this prompt is important to me. It doesn't exist in the real world already. I need this thing, therefore I'm going to spend the energy. I think that's legitimate. If it's my 700th cat meme of the day, perhaps it's a moment to take stock. Perhaps it's something that we think, actually, is this benefiting my learning? Is this benefiting my thinking? Is this benefiting my lifestyle? What do we need to do? And I think with the excitement around Genie 3, has anybody seen Genie 3? Genie 3 is this immersive world model. I want you to imagine the holodeck in Star Trek, where you could now go into a world, and Google has managed to figure out object permanence. You can look away and look back, and the same thing is there, like a toddler understands at about 2. It is fascinating. And in terms of assessment, this is really exciting. I've heard about sim-turnships and the idea that you could be immersed in a scenario and your skills could be actually physically tested in real time. That's incredible. Like that's the cap over the wall moment. That is the bit where I get really excited. And then I think of the energy that that requires. Just think back to Star Trek. They were even predicting it then. The holodeck would disappear when the nuclear reactors lost energy. And then Victorian London would flicker and you'd be back to reality. That is the concern that I have with 3D world generations. It's the natural conclusion of where we're going. With embodied AI, with robotics, with assessment, a real world, non-dangerous scenario. That's perfect for testing and assessing and demonstrating skills. But it comes at a cost. It absolutely comes at a cost. In the IB, we spent a lot of time thinking, especially in assessment development, about our friction points. Frictions including copyright, trying to get a license on an image, copyright-free, trying to get really exciting and interesting and translatable questions. All of these things can be ameliorated and augmented by AI. But they're all accumulating. Every single individual use is accumulating in a way that we don't see and that we don't really have to pay for. I presume if you ever use like Google Gemini Studio or something that actually tracks your tokens, you have a much better idea of how much you're consuming, how long your prompt is, how long your output is. They're really measurable, definable things. But this global consumption, some statistics here. So for example, 2026 originally was projected to be equal to Japan's national consumption. It's going to be 2025. We're talking that it would be equivalent to 85 million homes in the US or in California. And Stargate is predicted to provide 1.2 gigawatts. That's an insane amount of energy. Yesterday, or the day before, I can't remember, the days are beginning to blur, Meta announced a 5 gigawatt data center. 5 gigawatts. That's like 4 Back to the Futures. That's insane as an energy amount. They said when it was 1 gigawatt, that would be the energy footprint of Manhattan. So the scaling factor is a little bit out of control. When we think about NVIDIA and the GPU chips they're producing, they're also looking to go from 120 to 1,000 megawatts per rack. And an average data center might have 100 racks, it might have 10,000 racks. It creates a huge amount of heat, and it requires a huge amount of energy. And so about June, I was very worried about the conversation online. I was worried about the imbalance between tech bro enthusiasm and doom mongers and the Black Mirror enthusiasts, and nobody in between. And I was watching the conversations develop. It has quietened down, though. It's been very interesting. In June, there was a sort of a climate change denialism happening, where if you're worried about the energy consumed by AI, you should really be worrying about your hamburgers, because that's what's doing the damage. And if you're worried about AI, then you shouldn't be flying anywhere, because that's also CO2. And there was this kind of don't look over here, look over there moment. And the kind of language around it was very similar to the climate change denial playbook, which is we don't say energy, we say compute. We don't say power, we say capacity or cloud computing. We say anything rather than say the energy that we actually need to make this happen is ginormous, and it's phenomenal. So we have to balance those costs with benefits. And education doesn't control anything and should not control everything, but we do have a moral imperative for optimism. Otherwise, what's the point in doing any of this? What is the point in assessing learning? What is the point in progressing learning if we don't have a moral compass by which to operate? And one of the things that we say is, in all of the schools that we visit and all of the institutions we work with, there is a phenomenon of energy blindness happening. I've been guilty of it myself. I'm now much more careful about my energy use, and we'll talk about that later on. But I have been very, very concerned about how little I was concerned about this before, how excited I was about the potential, and how much I could see all of those dreams I had for education within my grasp. I love the idea that AI could unlock group assessment for once and for all. It would be amazing. If we could analyze micro moments, if we could analyze how an introvert starts to express an idea but it doesn't get fully developed, if we could analyze something different for students, something that would really level the playing field, something that would build on sentiment analysis, or that would project ideas or somehow interpolate behaviors. That's a brand new game. And it's very scary and it's very exciting. And AI could actually make that happen because we've never really trusted group assessment in a valid, reliable way. So as we said, about 3 months ago, and all over the summer, there was this false equivalence debate, which was, if you're really worried about this, you shouldn't be, you should be worried about your meat consumption. Coming from people like Sam Altman, for example, where he says, I particularly love when the anti-AI crowd makes up shit about our water usage while eating a hamburger. And then some very nicely selected statistics, where we have 1 hamburger compared to 1 prompt. And I think that's an interesting false equivalence because very few of us are eating 200 hamburgers a day. Not none, but not many. And I think that's what worries me, is that the debate and discussion has been dominated by precisely those people whose imperative it is to keep the energy running and to have priority access, as they do in Ireland at the moment, to have that priority access going. And it's been funny, over the summer, since the EU executive order, the conversation has changed. No longer is this kind of false equivalence. There's a much more honest discussion about saying, we need lots of energy for this. Where's it going to come from? Is it going to come from solar? Is it going to come from nuclear? Micronuclear? Is it going to come from solar nuclear? It's insane, some of the conversations that we're having. But the accepted wisdom now seems to be, we're just going to have to find this, or China's going to beat us, is the unspoken text sometimes. The US executive order makes it explicit. In fact, yesterday, I think the Department of Energy was saying, like, this is the #1 priority, no matter what. And the executive order gave them the license to do this, where they said, this is a national imperative, this is a national emergency, and no matter what department you're in, effectively, you're going to release land to make these data centers happen. Might be handy, if you pick the poorest, least combative areas of the US, put it just outside New Orleans, please, if you don't mind. Put it out in Ohio. Put it in places where maybe people won't object and resources might not be stretched. But ultimately, at this point, they're effectively allowed to choose wherever they want to base themselves. And they will have access to whatever energy they need by executive order. And I think this is speaking to the rest of the world. So we have China in a very similar, ironically, position where AI will be the accelerant for the Chinese people. And if you look at the Chinese AI curriculum, where they have kids from 3 to 18 learning AI and engaging with it and developing their literacy, if not always their ethics around it, then I think we find ourselves in a really weird place in the EU and in the UK, where most of our governments feel that this will be a massive lever for growth, and they want that. We've all wanted growth for a long time. So I think it's interesting that we don't have the moderated, balanced debate enough at the moment about it. There is almost zero resistance in the US to AI energy consumption. There is a little bit of pushback on chatbots and companions. Dan mentioned a little bit about that, but it's really interesting how the only legislation that's making it through the US government has been against using AI for therapy because of the serious human implications that has. But for energy, absolutely fine. Have at it. Do what you need to do. And they will be empowered by the departments. So when we look at the UK's position in terms of adopting AI in education and looking at the future with AI in assessment and curriculum, we need to think about that energy demand a lot more. We need to avoid the energy blindness, and then we need to make decisions in the interest of students, because not all AI uses are bad AI uses. The linguists, the special and educational needs and medical diagnoses, and Dan mentioned his sister, you can hear 100 powerful, inspirational stories like that in schools, of kids who didn't have a voice before, who couldn't access the curriculum, and are now succeeding. And that would be a terrible thing to waste. So we do have to have that. But we can't have dishonest discussions about it. We can't allow these kind of euphemisms like compute or inference or training runs to obscure the fact that all of that is energy, 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 energy. Workloads, energy. Compute, energy. That is what it is, and that's what it needs to be. I'm so glad you're here for this bit. So, edge computing, cloud computing, all of these terms, to me, when I hear them, I hear energy. And that's where the conversation needs to be. And within assessment, Let's do some numbers. Let's do some calculations. And of course, they are rough calculations due to the unavailability of information. And as they say, as the facts change, my mind changes. And sometimes I don't wait for the facts. But what we need to do is we need to really think about when we decide to move in any direction in AI, whether it's AI for question writing, item identification, seeding, marking, anything at all, we need to calculate as best we can the implications of those decisions. Because if we take an example from the MIT study, MIT did a really interesting study. As I said, some of the statistics are strong, some of them on interrogation weren't as good. But let's take an example of an assessment author. And anyone who's been in the room during an assessment authoring session knows that there will be blood on the walls for the sake of one word sometimes, and you will be at it for hours. So let's imagine you decide, we have a situation with question exposure, and we need more questions. We need more rich, varied questions. But we value human input. So we still want our authors. So one author might do 15 queries to check some statistics, to get an idea, to maybe ideate a question. And then they might do an image, because as we said earlier on, getting copyright-free images, license-free images, that is the dream, right? To get the perfect scientific diagram, to get the ultimate labeled water distillation. I remember a particular water distillation straw that was a nightmare to get approval for, and it had to be then animated and drawn. Bless you. If you did 10 attempts at the image to get that right, because the first image is never right, the numbers will be in the wrong place on the graph, the angle might be wrong, the feel of the question might be wrong, but with good prompting, maybe you got it in 10. The energy required for that 15 prompts, 10 images, and maybe a 5-second video. I had somebody submit me a piece of work the other day with a 5-second video generated by AI, which was designed to impress, and as soon as I opened it, I was like, oh, you could have just been in the email, it was fine. We don't need the energy for that necessarily. Because those uses, those 15 prompts, 10 questions, 10 images, and a short video is about 2.9 kilowatt hours of energy, which by MIT's calculations is about 10 miles in an electric car, or 3.5 hours microwaving. Like, that's an incredible amount of energy for one question that may be thrown out, that maybe was terrible, that maybe doesn't make it past the first round. But essentially, we need to start calculating those individual pockets of consumption and scale it and think what it means for us. So if we would go entirely over to digital on-screen, which is a focus, I'll skip this here, that's fine, we'll mention that. Let's use the closest to my heart, the IB diploma. And let's consider then just a basic calculation, lots of assumptions made in this calculation. But imagine we want to embrace AI to be an item writer because we would like to avoid some copyright entanglements. And we would like to at least allow the AI to open it up and see if there's even a response for a human to look at. I thought it was funny earlier on, Dan was mentioning about how teachers are so demoralized at the student use of AI. And it's funny, I'm hearing from students how demoralized they are at teacher use of AI. Terribly upset at reports that don't sound like them and feedback that they could have got for themselves from ChatGPT. So imagine we take that message and we say, okay, human eyeballs onto this assessment are still valuable, but at least we could use the AI to open up null responses and then close it down again, and that wouldn't have to go to the examiner. So if we did that, if we said, okay, this is great, this is a good use of AI, we are going to speed up our examiners, we're going to reduce our costs on human marking, we won't send them any empty entries. Let's think about the cost of the energy just for that one function, for one use case of opening up the AI, looks in, no answer, shuts it again. So by these calculations, of course, we would be thinking about sovereignty and security. We're thinking about marking assistance after the fact. But for the moment, we're just thinking about opening up the AI, it sees an answer, it closes it or not. And then we can scale it up for eventual marking. So let me take some rough statistics. Let's imagine in the last round of the May examinations in the diploma, there were 192,000 students. Now, not all students sit all papers, and not all papers have two subjects have two papers, so let's take some rough assumptions. If we had 192,000 students sitting, on average, 6 subjects, and in each paper, in each subject there were 2 papers. And in each paper, let's take a low ball number. Let's go 10 questions. Not sub-questions or anything, just 10 questions that have to be read by AI. That would mean that there were unique actions of 23 million cases. So 23 million little bits of energy to open and read and close. And that would be equivalent to an insane amount of energy. So I asked ChatGPT, I did the calculations as well, obviously, but I asked ChatGPT to find me some interesting equivalents. And I told it to use the lower end energy estimates. So the lighter models, the small language models, the ones that you can train and have locally, the ones that we could use very easily in an assessment platform. And one of the things it said was, I said, give me 5 equivalences that I can actually feel this amount of energy for the choice of opening and closing AI queries. And it gave me the following. I'll read you some of the more interesting ones. I asked it to calculate both energy and CO2 because they're very different relationships. And when we think of papers flying around the world, when we think of the energy required to scan the papers, when we think of that, we always think the paper bad, on screen good. And perhaps there is a tipping point where one is correct and the other one is correct. And we need to have a very honest, mathematical, data-driven discussion around that. So for energy, it estimated at the mid to lower end that it would be approximately 5,530 kilowatt hours, which would be approximately equivalent to 6 months of annual consumption of US homes, or driving 19,350 miles, or cooking 23,000 meals. And I thought, well, these numbers are large, that's fine, but maybe that's worth investing. Maybe that's something that we, as an organization, might say, okay, well, this is a good use of energy when we compare it to paper. So I asked it for some more. I said, okay, what are the CO2 emissions? And it gave me trees, flight, it gave me transatlantic flights, car emissions, all of the kind of standard CO2 markers that you would expect. Now, behind the statistics sits the fact that we already know that the CO2 emissions from planes have been exceeded by AI already in 2023. So AI has leapfrogged any CO2 emissions that we can blame the airline industry for. So she's making herself feel better about flying here this morning. So when I took some statistics from this, I thought, okay, well, let's have a much more reflective, honest discussion about this. At what point would on-screen be better for the planet than paper? Because it's interesting to think, and you have to pick apart so much in terms of paper production and transport costs and all of these incredibly difficult calculations, imperfect as they are, but at least it would give us an idea. It would give us an insight into what is the value judgment that we're making. So when I did that, I said, very simply, calculate the energy required for those 23 million queries. And at what point, and I gave it some energy statistics around paper assessment and delivery and transport and marking and so on. And I said, at what point, if we use this for 2.3 million queries, at what point would the break even happen? And I think that's the calculation we need to have when we're thinking about on-screen assessment. At what point is it a net benefit, either for the environment, or, dare I say it, for financial considerations, or for exam authenticity and integrity? These are the calculations we need to do. And I think at this point it said, it would be better to go with AI until you get to 1.92 billion queries. And I did some quick calculations to see how many sub-questions would that give me in a paper, and how many students would I have to grow to make that worthwhile. And these are very, very complex calculations, right? So you want to be able to get all of these different parameters in. But it's a sense that I wanted. And I thought, well, that was interesting. It takes much longer for the break-even point of CO2. So then I have to decide which one matters to me more, the cost of energy or the CO2 in the environment. And I was very happy not to have to make those decisions based on this hypothetical case. But I could see why these questions are easier not to think about or to avoid or to discount because they're too difficult to quantify. And I think that is, unfortunately, a part of the homework that we're going to have to do. We're going to have to say, okay, every decision we make to move to either on-screen or AI comes with an energy cost. And those costs, when we're in schools, we think, well, there's no point in pointing at the obvious, despairing, wailing, and leaving schools with a huge amount of Catholic guilt. What I do instead is I say, okay, how do we actually make wise decisions so that we don't replicate the mistakes of plastic? Plastic is an incredible material. it keeps people alive, it keeps us safe, it keeps our world hygienic, and we got very addicted to it. And we got very, very, very serious environmental consequences. So what we have to do instead is think, okay, how do we avoid the lessons of plastic? How do we get downstream of the problem with students and with teachers and with institutions so that we make the right decisions for the environment, for students, and for learning? Now, when we're in schools, these are the questions I always ask teachers to use before they decide whether they're going to continue with an AI action, which is, after your use of AI, is your classroom environment genuinely richer? Because so many of us are kind of seduced into shiny tools, and it's exciting, and it's innovative when it just looks flashier. So we have to have an honest deliberation or an honest reflection on, is your classroom actually the environment richer? Has it freed up time? Like genuinely has it freed up time? Because, just checking time, we see in schools that the people who have freed up time and boast about it and share it and say, oh, I've saved 10% of my working week this week, I've automated my grading, or I've given my voice to 11 labs and it will send out a podcast to parents so I don't have to do work like updates anymore. And we've seen now in 3 different schools that those early adopters are being given extra work. They're being given an extra class, they're being given extra responsibilities because they freed up time. So we have to think, if AI does free up time, how do we use it to the benefit of the profession, of your well-being, whatever it might be? If the classroom environment isn't richer, it wasn't a good use of energy. If it hasn't freed up time, then you are chasing productivity or efficiency or something else, because there's never been an easier time in the history of humanity to work yourself to death. So it is very important that we think about those restrictions. Has it reduced productive struggle in students? If it has, that's when the alarm bells should go off, because this is what we're seeing in so many schools at the moment. We're seeing a cognitive offloading in a way that we haven't seen before. We haven't seen it since probably Google and Wikipedia, and they learned how to cut and paste. We haven't seen this reach for AI quicker than they'll talk to the student beside them, quicker than they'll ask an adult. And they're positively promoting that on TikTok. They're saying, look what I did with ChatGPT at 3 a.m. with my trauma dump, and they'll share the whole context. Or they'll share the God mode unlock that they've used. It's really intriguing. When you go onto TikTok and you see what they're talking about with AI and assessment in the 15 to 18 age range, fascinating. Fascinating how they're sharing tips and tricks and scare stories and like mental arithmetic that they're doing around this. Knows that AI can know you better than anyone can know anybody ever. It knows you better than you know yourself. It will advise you how to become whatever you want to be, and it will give the prompts. So I mean, it's some good education sharing when you think about it. But for assessment, we need to ask the exact same questions. If it hasn't made our assessment environment richer, was it a good investment? Was it a useful thing to do? And that's why I really like the approach that we're talking about today, which is evidence-based, researched, thoughtful adoption of AI and not indiscriminate, reckless experimentation. Has it truly innovated our offering? That's what I was excited about with simulations within an assessment. The ability for translation to be friction-free. The ability for accessibility for everybody on every level. That's really exciting, and that's worth the investment. But if it hasn't actually innovated, if it's merely refreshed or augmented or made it look prettier or cheaper, then is that a good use of AI? And then lastly, have we made it easier for students? The productive struggle is something I'm hearing a lot in schools. Now, we always moaned about kids forgetting stuff. We'd say they come back in from summer and everything is gone. We'd say, I taught you this last year, why don't you remember? But there's a bite to the conversation now from teachers. They're saying and they're suggesting, and I have no data to back this up other than teacher moaning, is that students are retaining information less and less. They're retaining it on a shallower level because they never truly engaged with it with some of the scaffolding that we're giving them. So some of the scaffolding is so detailed now. If you go into a school and a teacher with the best will in the world has scaffolded, as we say in Ireland, scaffolded the bejesus out of it, they can no longer stand up when you remove the scaffold because they become very reliant on that level of differentiation. And there's a concern here around cognitive offloading and retention. We've worried enough about attention, thanks to social media. It's now probably time to think a little bit more about retention, which is so relevant for assessment. If we're thinking proximal assessment, if we're thinking distal assessment, these are all factors we need to consider. And AI can help those things, and AI can also burn the planet at the same time. So we need to think about those. So in schools, I'm always asking them to think about the school's philosophy and their personal approach to assessment, because the best way to get ahead of a problem is to get downstream of the problem and think, where are we adopting it ethically? How will we do this sustainably? What elements or what culture about good use cases and bad use cases can we bring to a school? That's the most important thing, that we're discerning. We have spent in the IB world decades helping students really value critical thinking. And the limits of critical thinking are now obvious, because you can establish and you can question and you can verify your sources, and then you have to decide. Then you have to discern whether you trust something, whether you believe in something. And AI has blurred all of that. So we need critical discernment. We need an ability to uphold standards, because one of the greatest risks of AI, say to every school, we talk about bias, we talk about hallucinations or confabulations, but the biggest risk in schools that I'm seeing is acceptance of mediocrity. It's the acceptance of volume or convincing text or something that looks like it should be right. And students who are allowing that to shape their own writing styles and their own expectations, and teachers are becoming, hopefully, the arbiters of taste. They're the ones who have to get and go, no, that's not good enough. It's a fine response, it's just not interesting. It's a fine response, it meets the requirements, but it isn't you. It's not your voice. Are you proud of this? So those kind of reflective questions, we're having to have teachers who didn't need to do that before. We were the automatic arbiters of taste, but now we are very explicitly having to do that. We also have some micro decisions that we can make. We don't always need the very best model for every single use case. So it is important to think about that energy paradox. AI may well solve all of our energy problems, but we're going to have to invest a huge amount of energy to get there. It hasn't yet, with a couple of exceptions about like optimizing batteries and reducing some kind of heat limitations. AI hasn't really driven it forward at all in terms of energy development, but it could, and it probably should. And that would be where I would love to see our energy going, to solving some of the world's greatest problems. But in the meantime, we can only control our decisions. We can only have that moment before you put a bottle in the recycling or in the bin, where you have agency over that tiny, tiny decision. And no matter what vast industrial complexes are doing, we have the ability to inspire kids to do that too. So we have to ask ourselves, is the tool I'm using absolutely necessary? Does it have to be this one? Could I check the AI energy score? And these kind of things are starting to emerge. An AI energy score, people at Hugging Face and Salesforce are trying to do some of these calculations to help us make active decisions. And for me as well, one of the things that I like to do is I like to check that, because if there's a 60,000x difference between the highest model and the lowest model, I've said it before, I'm going to pick something in my wine choosing range, where I'll go like second or third cheapest. I'm not going to go to the bottom, and I'm not going to spend the most. I'm going to think about what model will meet my needs, what model will do the job, without having to go to the nth degree. And I think it's really interesting. A lot of these tools are now becoming more and more prevalent, but you have to look for them, and you have to know about the issue to do the homework and think about it. And you'll see lots and lots of kind of infographics that'll give you scare stories, but ultimately AI has been adopted, it is being adopted, and we need to now take a moment and pause and think, okay, what does conscious consumption actually look like? And this is where I think the energy use that we can control can be beneficial. If we're going to use it for seeding, if we're going to use it for marking, how can we lower the carbon footprint of that practice? How can we establish parameters around it or guardrails around it? Because we haven't even thought about hallucinations or bias within assessment itself. But we do need to think about what percentage of our practices could be offloaded to AI, and then what percentage should be, and how are we going to protect that? So this is, again, something that I do, which is insane, in that I track my own AI usage. I would not advocate anybody does that, because you spend your time counting how many queries you've done. Now, I have to update this, because in the preparation of the statistics, I did 13 Claude queries. This was for June's session, so I'm recycling. So I'm living by my own principles. I'm trying to recycle some of this, and I have done 4 more queries since, as you saw. And then I did all the manual calculations to double check, because I enjoy that kind of thing. But it's important that if I don't have to use a deep research query, I won't. If I don't have to generate an image, if it already exists in the universe, I'll go and find that image. And that's where we're seeing a struggle with students. They would rather go to ChatGPT than reach in their bag. And the answer is probably in their bag. And that's quite concerning. And that's something that we don't want to lead the way with assessment. Because if assessment leads the way, if we act with purpose and we act with integrity and we model for schools, we know schools follow assessment. Of course they do. It's the North Star for them to ensure success for their students. So if we can do that, if we can model discernment, deliberation, cautious consideration, without going too slowly to be left behind, because that's a real concern, we do need to do that and do the homework and do the boring bits of data processing and think, okay, what is the impact of this choice in this moment as we go forward? Because the model determinations and demands will drop and consumption will increase. We know that from Jevons paradox. We see it every single time a new model comes up. Everybody rushes to test it. Some of them plateau. Some of them continue in consumption. And it's not going to stop. And nor should it. But we should do it carefully and with integrity and with intention. So I would absolutely love to say thank you so much for inviting me. We have time for questions. I would love if you would like access to the slides or you want to query or challenge any of the statistics or send me fascinating facts, which I really love, then I'd invite you to connect with me on LinkedIn. I would love to hear if anybody has any questions, more specifics. There's been a lot of data there. Irish people love to talk at speed. So if you'd like to, I'd like to give the microphones out if anybody would like to either ask some questions, make a riposte, consider the alternatives, or just tell me I'm fabulous. All of those things are great.
Thank you. Is it on? Yeah. It's more your last point. I think you're fabulous.
Thank you very much. Next.
My question, I mean, you talked about the massive growth in energy demand, therefore increased cost of energy. To what extent can you see a future where the cost of energy and therefore the increase of cost of running AI actually prices out certain sectors like education and assessment? Is there a potential future where we don't really get to play because it's just too costly?
Honestly, probably not, because who do they want to sell the AI to? They want to sell it to enterprise and industry and people who can afford it at the moment. I think other than military complexes, I don't know who else would be their customer if they had priced out normal enterprise. I think the concern that I have is if we look at the very recent history, when Elon Musk's XAI was way behind. They were like 2 to 3 years behind in development. So what did they do? They threw everything at it. They hired every diesel generator that was available in the US. They bought 70% of coolants. And within 2 to 3 months, they had caught up because they threw energy and money at the problem. Now, my concern, obviously, as we move through a SaaS world and a freemium addiction, is of course they're going to need to recoup this investment. And we never know we're sitting in the middle of a bubble until it pops. The amount of money floating around in AI does, for me, think, okay, yes, eventually it will be a premium product. It will definitely price out a lot of people. I'm not sure the assessment industry will be their first target to cut. It will be free users. It will be access to everybody that will go first. Or, I spend a lot of time trying to think through the multiverses of like what all the possibilities are. And one of them that I can see is that the AI reaches a plateau of productivity, and then that's what's offered to everyone. And then there's an elite AI that is at the next step. So I think we would still always be able to access that standard AI, but AGI might be out of our grip. And that might be where we see power and privilege play out. But I think it's a very difficult question. I don't think that AI needs industry and AI needs enterprise consumers, and that's what we are. So I think, no, we would be the second last to go. Yeah.
Thank you. So one of the questions towards the end was, could a less resource-intensive alternative meet the same goal? I think it's really important. I think an observation is we seem to be, or many people are equating automation with a need for AI. And the example you gave was of the marking of the amount of energy required to open up a response, see if it was null response and not send it to the platform. Well, that's something that can be achieved in any half-decent platform with a few lines of code.
And, so at 1/30th, the energy demand, because we know that every bot that you develop, you reduce the training demands, So if you have a bot connected to a bot connected to a bot, then you have a 30th reduction factor in each one. You could reduce it with good automation.
Yeah.
My concern is that maybe that automation, the sexiness of agents that we talk about a lot, is misleading in that sense. But I absolutely, sorry to interrupt your point. No, I absolutely agree with you.
I think as an industry, an observation, we need to be thinking about, yes, what benefit can we deliver through AI that we could not get by other means? And just because I want to automate something, do I really need to resort to AI? Because what you're saying is pretty scary.
And also having an industry-wide acceptance of the difference between the automation and the agentic AI, because I think you're absolutely right. The example that I give is purely automation, which does require that lower level of energy. And it will be the marking then that steps it up again. And then it will be the production of a response that steps it up even more. And then it will be the sending the response to the correct PRM or the CRM or wherever it needs to go. That's where we start to see it step up. And that's where I worry that we don't do enough granular thinking about consequence A, consequence B, consequence C, because it's complex. In a world of complexity, we have enough already, but this is important work. But I think you're absolutely right. A better classification of automation, agentic AI and AI agents, which are also slightly different, and a proper determination of what the energy requirements are for each. And I think that is something that's out of our grip at the moment. We certainly don't have access to any of that data, so we're having to do imperfect calculations and make decisions based on imperfect data, but at least made with the right reasons and with the right motivations. Any others? It's going to be a tricky one now.
I think the previous point was absolutely critically made. One of the challenges I have is saying, no, I don't want AI marking, I want automated marking, and we do that with MCQs, it doesn't require AI. I think a lot of the points you made about teaching young people not to use AI when different techniques are absolutely critical. One of the things I'm really trying to think about is how we teach young people about good use of AI, and a lot of what we said here is great. I just want to call you up. There was a lot of similarity between digital assessment and on-screen assessment and AI. The two are massively different. We're not intending within the IB to have AI marking anytime soon, because I still, don't have the evidence that I trust it quite yet. But the benefits to a student to being able to have a video playing, which is not AI generated, is great. So let's not throw digital assessment out with the AI.
Absolutely. No, and I think it's a point that maybe you missed at the beginning. I made that is the excitement about it. And I think also where is really very, very important is if we want to scale our offerings to 5 million students, for example, these are incredible opportunities, and classification and categorization really matter. The clarity around what schools can understand and access. When I go to schools and I talk about agents, it is too much for them. They cannot even consider it. They just say, tell me what will be on screen and we'll figure it out. And I'm like, well, that's not my role. My role is to think about curriculum and how we can learn. So one of the things I've spent since June, I've spent until now, is developing what's really crucial in an AI curriculum, looking at what other countries are doing. How do we get downstream? What will actually matter as skills or competencies? Is it model familiarity? Is it flexible adaptation? Is it going to be multi-layered thinking? What will we have left when knowledge has been taken and skills have been absorbed or eroded? And that's what I've spent a long time grappling with. So I kind of have mapped out now what I think that needs to look like, what the skills will be. They'll be dynamic because they're going to keep changing. By the time you write an AI curriculum, it's out of date. So how do you future-proof students? How do we safeguard education? That's the reason this company is called Eblana, is because it's about preservation and retention of what matters and the ability to innovate. So it's a big, long, boring story. You can ask me at lunch. But it is important that we have a responsibility to education itself. We always talk about the students as data points. We talk about the teachers as pressure points. But actual learning and knowledge is vital to be protected. We are an unbroken chain of information for thousands of years. And if we offload it and embody it elsewhere, then we are not doing right by it exclusively. So thank you so much. Are we out of time? We are a little. Yes, we have a little bit. We have one more question if anybody has one, because I know I'll answer for about 5 minutes worth. Yeah? Look how efficient I am. Oh, brilliant. Okay, fantastic.
Thanks, Sam. Do you believe that exam owners, awarding organisations need to start disclosing their energy use across test development through test delivery and reporting,
Great
perhaps
question.
mandated by a regulator?
That's such a great question. Mandated by regulator, I'm not sure. I'm not sure that that would lie in line with the focus of the UK government, for example. It would very much sit with the EU and the EU AI Act, which I'm sure most of you are very familiar with now in terms of what that requires schools to do. Schools have a high threshold of things they have to meet. I asked this question. I was meeting with an assessment platform developer recently, Assess Prep, and I asked them this very question. They said, oh, we can have AI embedded and it can be here and here and here. And I was like, how can I track the use of AI then? And they said, oh, well, we can give you a readout. We can give you how many queries were made, and then you can do the calculations as to how much it would be used. And I said, do you do that automatically? And they said, no, but we can. And I thought, well, that's fascinating, because then you are passing back, first of all, the onus and responsibility to me, which as the assessment provider, perhaps it belongs with me. Can it be regulated? I never thought I'd live in a world where the airlines had to produce statements around their CO2s. So I'm not sure. I would love to think that, yes, we will have a much more mature, reasoned debate about energy consumption once we burn through this next year or two of enthusiasm. I think as we see the AI agent conversation play out, as we see world models play out, and as we hear more and more excitement about virtual reality and augmented reality, which will come back again, I think at that point then we might be ready to have that conversation. And what a shame to have it 3 years too late, when we know we need to be having it now. But I don't see the UK moving in terms of more regulation and less around this area. I do see the European Union, although in the last couple of weeks it looks like the European Union is getting cold feet about many of these implications. It looks like there is a lot of pressure to stop the clock. There's a lot of pressure to delay. It's very interesting to see how the geopolitical environment and possibly underneath that, the fear of military use of AI or something else is bubbling along underneath in these conversations, or the fear of being left behind. Like, Europe only has Mistral to look to in terms of AI excitement and innovation. Maybe I haven't really played with the Swiss model very much yet, but we have very few things to point to in terms of innovation, and that also worries the European Union. So I don't think regulation will be the first changes that we see in that sector. No, but I would love to see it. How great would that be if you could there is a thing that we use with students developed by a teacher in China, and the students can put in how many queries, how many images, how many videos, and it will give them an approximate CO2 statement. It does nothing other than inform them of potentially you've used this much, but it reframes their decision making and it gives them a little bit more agency. And I spoke to a teacher yesterday, and she has students in her class who will refuse to use AI, even if it's part of the assignment. Very few. And I thought it was going to be an environmental concern. And she said, no, they're artists, and they really dislike what AI is doing to art and how it has effectively steamrolled over intellectual property and copyright. And I thought, wow, what incredible young people to have that level of conviction to say, I know you want me to use AI, I know you want me to have future-ready skills, but I'm not comfortable, and I don't want to, and you can't make me. That conversation is really powerful. So I think, yes, we absolutely need more disclosure, more transparency, and more deliberation around these decisions before we make them. Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Rita. That was